Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's ThreadX program powered by TechStrong Group. My name is Jared Harris, and I'll be your host for today's discussion. We've got a great program ahead of us, but before we begin, I do have a few housekeeping notes for you all. Today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any of the discussion or you'd like to recommend this to a friend, we will be sending out a link at the end of the program once it concludes to your email, so you can rewatch it as many times as you want. If you have any questions, we'd like you to submit them in the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen. You should see it. You can also send direct messages to our speakers if you'd like. You can also see the chat section on the right, just to the left of the Q&A tab, where we would love to hear from you. You can talk with other other audience members. Just let us know where you're signing in from, share your thoughts, and all of that good stuff. We do have a poll, so be sure to stick around. We'd love to hear how you want to, what your thought is on the poll. And finally, we will be giving out some gift cards as soon to whoever is here throughout the duration of the program, whoever is, asking the best questions, all of that good stuff. Just want to make sure that you're participating. And so at this point, we're going to go ahead and kick off today's topic. It is Protect Your APIs Today for a Safer Tomorrow. And today we are joined with Jeremy Ventura. He is the field CISO at ThreadX. Jeremy, at this time, I'm going to turn off my camera and I'm going to let you take it over from here.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jared. And thank you to TechStrong to inviting me and having me represent not only myself, but ThreadX as well. And so thank you, everybody, for joining. I know it's afternoon for some people, evening for some people. If anyone doesn't mind, go in the chat real quick and actually just type in where you're calling in from or where you're located from. It's always really cool to see people from all around the world that join these different webinars. So say hi to each other and let everybody know where you're calling in from today. But without further ado, as Jared mentioned, my name is Jeremy Ventura. I am the Director of Security and also Field CISO for ThreadX. And I'll start off with a little bit about myself, and then I'll get into a little bit of ThreadX. But I've been in the security industry ever since college and graduating, and now over almost a decade and a half. But I've come from many different backgrounds where I've worked for companies such as IBM, Mimecast and email security, Tenable and vulnerability management, even working internal security for companies like Raytheon and Gong, which is a AI revenue generating company. And so I think that really comes from a very different background perspective, especially on the topic of APIs. Usually when I'm at conferences or API seminars, a lot of the individuals come from specifically engineering or development backgrounds. And I think what makes my presentation and kind of my perspective on this landscape and this field is coming from a very unique perspective. And that comes from the pure cybersecurity aspect of this field. And that also allows me to look at this with a different lens and understanding my background and kind of where I've grown from. I've helped organizations from advising, consulting to actually building cybersecurity programs myself. And for me specifically, the reason I joined ThreadX was because at my previous gigs, API security was becoming, and still is, a hot topic. When we think about APIs and we think about everything we do, they really are the bloodline or the connective tissue of applications and how we operate, how we send data, how we transmit data, how we store data, how we process data. And as I was going through my career, APIs and API security was always coming up. How do you protect your APIs? What's the governance and compliance and risk to them? How are they secured? And it was a natural evolution for me to join ThreadX. And I've been here now just over a year. And so a little bit about ThreadX in general, and we're going to get into it a little bit more, but ThreadX has been around now coming up on a decade. And ThreadX is traditionally been known to be in the WAP, web application and API space. And so think of your layer 7, your web application firewalls. That's where ThreadX has always played up until recently. And recently, what we realized is the evolution of how applications have moved to APIs. We started to build and enhance our product and functionality around API security as well. And then from there, we're going to get into kind of what we've just released. We're actually releasing it this week and talking a lot about it. But it's the natural evolution of, well, how do you build APIs? What is the API security threat when it comes to things like runtime security? So I'll be covering a little bit about that today as well. A little bit more about ThreadX. But I know I've got an hour. Again, if there's any questions as we go through them, please put them in the Q&A. We do have a poll coming up pretty soon, but I'd love to keep it interactive and answer any questions as they come up. But without further ado, today's presentation, protecting APIs today for a safer tomorrow. And there's really three high-level categories I want to talk about. The first is I want to give everybody a really good understanding of this API threat landscape. I think we all hear it in our field. We know there's a real threat. A lot of organizations, though, are struggling in many different realms of API security, from visibility to how do I protect it to how do I block that. And so today we're going to uncover some of the different threats that organizations face, and we're going to go over some use cases. How are attackers actually targeting your organization? From there, I'm going to get a little bit more into ThreatX, but looking at the ThreatX solution, but in general, looking at how you can protect your applications, your company, and your business from an edge perspective, also from a runtime, to give you a really full completeness of API and application security. And last but not least, which is actually my favorite, and it's my favorite because this is my background, I'm going to discuss and talk about really three categories of when you build an API security team, or you build any cybersecurity team. Breaking it down from a red teaming perspective, which is your offensive security, a blue team defensive, which is your defensive security, and then what does that mean together? And then we call that purple teaming, right? The collaboration aspect. And I'm going to go more and more into kind of what this breaks down into, and we'll go from there. But we have a really good agenda today and really good presentation, so stay tuned. So what I first want to do is talk about, again, the API landscape. As I mentioned before, APIs are really the connective tissue between everything we do. When we think about this, every application or every software application is either an API or uses an API, if not multiple APIs, to connect, right? To store data, to transmit data, to process data. I was just talking to a healthcare company just this morning, and this healthcare organization, you wouldn't think, oh, healthcare, they don't use APIs. Actually, they have hundreds, if not thousands of APIs in their landscape because of everything they need to do, from sending patient data to other healthcare systems or other tools and technologies or software applications. For example, if you need an MRI and you need to process that data in a different application, or now we have everything on our phones and apps, right? That data may be sent via an API call, right? It could be your PHI information, your first name, your last name, your medical history. Think even for a credit union in a bank. If I want to go get a new loan, or I want to do a refinance on my mortgage, I may actually be using a credit union over here, but going through a real estate software application. And that data that's being sent is typically an API. And when you think about APIs, not only are just businesses using them from an external standpoint, but we also see APIs being used internally from organizations. APIs, really, the word I like to use is increase velocity, increase the efficiency and the speed for developers. Now we can produce more and more code effectively by leveraging APIs internally to make sure that, if I'm designing maybe the shape of a button on my website, and then I got to give that to a different individual or different team, and they're putting, they're going to make sure it's green or red or black, whatever it might be, I can actually transfer that product or my code via APIs, right? And that allows them to gain better speed and efficiency and produce faster. Now, with that being said, APIs really do connect almost everything we do. I'll give you another real life example. Just today, I live here in Orange County in Southern California, and Monday mornings are always busy for the Starbucks line. And so I tried to beat that, and I used my phone. I used my mobile app, and I say, okay, I'm going to pay for my coffee and my bagel today, and I'm going to do that via Apple Pay. When we think about that transaction, we think about those APIs, right? That's exactly what it is. It's sending my data, my credit card information, or my Apple Pay information to the Starbucks software application and saying, let's do this transaction. And within seconds, if not milliseconds, I've now paid for my coffee, and now I'm a happy customer. And so we think about, on an everyday usage, whether it's checking the weather in geolocation, whether it's, using Apple Pay or some type of payment for it, or again, that healthcare examination, APIs really connect everything we do and run the world we're in. So with that being said, I also like to show this screen, and I like to do things sometimes even at a 50,000 foot level, because not everybody, even watching this webinar right now, is familiar with APIs or API security. And it's funny, I was actually asked recently to go into an elementary school and explain my company and what we do for like 7-year-olds. And so I broke it up like this. I broke it up as an octopus. When we think about an octopus, really the body, right? The brain, the body of an octopus is the application. The 8 tentacles, 6 arms, 2 legs, that allow that octopus to maneuver, to eat, to mate, to have vision, to smell, to maneuver on the ocean floor. That is its tentacles, right? That is bloodline, again, to allow them to maneuver, to really live. When we think about an application, APIs are really the tentacles, right? They actually allow you to connect to other systems and other tools. And so, if you don't remember anything from the PowerPoint and the presentation, there's one thing that you remember: the octopus, right? The octopus is the application, the tentacles are the APIs. Really, they allow the application to breathe, to live, to maneuver. And so, that is my how to explain APIs and applications at a 50,000-foot view for elementary school. So, as we go forward, though, we'll get a little bit deeper. But the first thing I'm going to do right now is I'm actually going to launch this poll. So on your screens right now, you will see a poll. Please take a couple seconds here to just fill this out. But the question is, what percent of internet traffic is API traffic? And this is estimated as of 2023 coming in. So I'll give a couple more seconds for everybody to answer this. But what percent of internet traffic is API traffic? We got about 10 more seconds. Perfect. I'm going to close the poll right now. So let's see. Poll results. The poll results right here just showed that over 85% of people got it right. 80%. 80% of all internet traffic is an API call. And that may not be of shock to most people, but when we think about, again, going back to how applications maneuver and how they run, right? We got APIs that are making sure that those transactions or those processes are actually enabling your application. So with that being said, though, we need to actually take a different lens of this. And while, I've kind of harped on here for the last couple of minutes on why APIs are so heavily used and why they're developed, this also means the more sometimes things are used, the more risk it creates for our organizations. And so just take a look at this chart here on the left-hand side of your screen. We can see Postman, which is a technology company, has said in 2023 alone, they've estimated it as almost 1.3 billion API calls, and that is per day. 1.3 billion API calls accessible over the internet per day. Now, they've actually started to come out with 2024, and they won't know just yet because we're not in 2024. But right now, their prediction is that number is potentially going to double. So we're talking almost 2.5, 2.6 billion API calls per day. What does that create? That actually creates a huge risk, what I like to call the blast radius zone, meaning the more usage you have, the more risk you're creating for hackers to potentially infiltrate or exploit vulnerabilities within your APIs. And we think about this, organizations use hundreds, if not thousands of APIs potentially, and security traditionally has always fell behind when it comes to SDLC or software development lifecycle or CI/CD pipeline, continuous integration, continuous development. What that really means is as developers are coding and they're creating product before it goes to production, security is always struggled trying to get the hook in there, right? Trying to get the test in there. And this is true even for API security. And I will say one of the biggest things that some organizations struggle with is just understanding who owns the APIs, who owns API security. So if there is actually an incident with one of my APIs, whose responsibility is it? I should have put it in here in the PowerPoints, but I didn't on this one. But I'm sure some people are familiar with that Spider-Man meme where they all sit there and they all point at each other. That's legitimate. When we walk into organizations, we ask the question of who owns API security. Typically, organizations and individuals, different departments are pointing fingers at each other because no one has really taken full ownership for most organizations. And that's because it does touch a little bit of every organization. It touches a little bit of development, how you code, how you practice that, how you develop your API. But if something goes wrong, like a credential stuffing attack or a bot attack or a DDoS attack, well, who owns the responsibility of making sure that API is secure? Or how do you remediate that API? And so that's where we're struggling sometimes in the field with organizations of really understanding who owns API security. And then, as we know this, hackers are getting smarter. They know there's a gap there. And so what hackers are doing is they're going and they're leveraging different tools and technologies to go and breach your APIs. And if we take a look at some of the recent breaches we've had just in the last up to 18 months, we've got some major organizations. And I want to be very clear. This is not to call out any of these companies or these brands. I've actually worked with a lot of these brands you've seen here on this screen from previous organizations and previous companies that I've worked for. When you look at these brands, though, there's kind of a couple unique things. We're talking about global brands. We're talking about, for the most part, security teams or even engineering teams that have staffing. They have budget for the most part, and still they're getting hit with API security incidents or breaches. And that just goes to show you that regardless of the size of your organization or how much money you spend, the more and more we leverage APIs, the more and more hackers are going to go after. It was actually, I will say, in the Verizon data breach report in 2023, just came out a couple months ago, about 2 months ago. And it was the first time that I can recall that web applications actually took the top spot for attack vectors leading to a data breach. Web applications were the number one. And when you think web applications, again, we can think about APIs and how they're actually able to infiltrate that application or manipulate that application. And so Gartner, from organizations like Techstrom, Verizon, everyone's recognizing that this is a serious problem and that organizations of all shapes, all sizes, all industries really need to get a better understanding on their APIs and how to protect them. And I will actually leave you with, I'm sure I won't, I will mention the company because I did mention it here, but I'm sure that some people have seen just in the last couple of weeks here, 23andMe, the big DNA, genetics company, just announced they had a big cybersecurity incident, and they said it was because of credential stuffing attack. And so when we think about how applications are being hit and how APIs are being hit, we're thinking about credential stuffing again, right? Reusing credentials that somebody may have found online or in the dark net to hit a website to see if I can log in successfully with this stolen username and credential. So when you think about some of the different techniques and types, now I'm not specifically calling out 23andMe what happened to them because it's still under investigation. There's still more information to come. But when we think about reusing username and passwords, I mean, how many of us on the call, have the same password for multiple applications? Probably the majority of us. Right. And even if we're in security, probably the majority of us, regardless of multi-factor authentication or two-factor, whatever it might be. And when we think about that, we think about how hackers are able to infiltrate organizations. A lot of the stuff isn't necessarily like the super most technical way to do this. Right. They're going online or the dark net. They're finding a populated list of compromised usernames and passwords, and they're attacking your organization and just hoping that just one potentially is lucky for me to get in and to get into your organization. So we need to be really aware of kind of, what's going on in the real world and how this affects your organization as well. So moving forward, a couple things I want to talk about here is, again, I started talking about like credential stuffing, some of the different use cases we've seen, but a couple of points I want to make here is, as I mentioned before, a lot of solutions, a lot of technologies in the marketplace up until this time have really focused on your traditional OWASP top 10 or your traditional OWASP API top 10, which is a newer version specifically for APIs from OWASP. And there's been a couple updates over the recent years about what that top 10 list includes, whether it's, BOLA attacks, SQL injection, misconfigurations, whatever it might be. And a lot of the solutions and a lot of the technologies in place today have really focused on these top 10. And while that's a great fundamental start, that's not everything. Hackers know that. Hackers know that you may have a solution in place that's really good at picking out those top 10 or 8 of the top 10. But they also know there's ways to bypass technology systems and tools. And one of those ways is even something we call solver services. And I'm not sure if anyone's actually heard of that, but that is a way for an individual to go in the dark net, let's say Tor, and go and hire pretty much somebody for hire or attack as a service. And it's called solver service. It's pretty much cracking your major web application firewalls or even your WAP players. And what's interesting about that is the cost. It could typically take anywhere, last I seen was anywhere between 25 and 40 US dollars to pay a service to actually go and hopefully bypass your existing technology that's supposed to be protecting you at all costs. And so again, hacking is becoming easier than ever, right? It's not really, when you think about financially, it's not costing hackers a lot of money, right? Really that big asterisk there is time. Do I have the time to go after your organizations and probe around your network? And that's everything. And that's why I put that image right there. is I think as an industry, we really focus on this top 10, and it's great. Don't get me wrong, it's fundamental, but we need to look what's below, right? What is underneath that iceberg? And we've got these sophisticated, what we call multi-vector or multi-mode attacks, where it's where an attacker will attack multiple layers within your network. So, maybe layer 7 at your application layer, they're doing a DDoS attack, but maybe at layer 3 or layer 4, or, at the network layer or another transport layer, they're doing something else to try to, mitigate or try to get your security or engineering team distracted. If I hit your website with a DDoS attack, everyone's going to go and focus on that DDoS attack. Okay, what's going on? Where are these IP addresses coming in from? At the same time, you have another attacker group, or the same attacker group or individual attacking you from a different point or a different entry point. And I think that's really where we're seeing a lot of these attacks starting to evolve, right? The sophistication of them are becoming more evolved and more mature because there's more ways to bypass systems. And we'll talk a little bit about what those systems are and kind of the right approach. But just know that the complexion and the automation of how these attacks are going after your organization are becoming more and more sophisticated, as we've seen in recent breaches and incident newses. And, I know we could do a whole presentation probably on AI and how that affects this, but AI does have a really big play, even with API security, but in general, all cybersecurity. And again, exceeding and allowing attackers to become more sophisticated and more efficient, right? Gaining more speed in how to attack your organization. So this really does require, in my opinion, a different approach. And what is that approach? Where do you need to start? Where do you need to look from? I think the first thing is understanding, traditionally, organizations have always looked at APIs and applications from pretty much an ingress standpoint. So what is the attacker, or what is that HTTP or HTTPS traffic doing? How is it hitting my application or my firewall, my gateway? And then how do I analyze that? And traditionally, that's been completely fine, right? That should hopefully catch the majority of security incidents, or I should say security alerting. However, what a lot of organizations kind of forget about is what's actually happening inside the house. And the best way I like to give an analogy is take the left side, for example, the edge protection is what we call it, right? That is like if you walked into a bar or a nightclub and there was a bouncer at the front door checking your name. Okay, you're on the approved list. Come on in. What if that bouncer actually followed you? So once they check your name, they now follow you everywhere inside that venue, making sure that, again, you're doing security checks at every single point. Okay, this person is allowed or is over the age of 21. They can get that beer. Or, okay, they want to get some food, or they want to use the restroom. Imagine that security guard kind of never leaving your side, right? They now protect you inside that venue. That's where this field is going. And that's what we call runtime security, which is the right-hand side. Looking and gaining visibility inside the applications at runtime, or APIs at runtime. And there's a couple different examples of what we give. And the first one is zero-day attacks. And so is anyone familiar? You can put it in the chat. I know most security professionals will be familiar, but Log4j. Everyone remember that? That was a scary time. And when Log4j popped up, a lot of organizations had no idea where it was, or if they were using the libraries, or where it was inside their applications. And, we knew it was a critical security flaw in the Apache logging framework. But again, it wasn't until a lot of these applications were pushed to production and then they were running until organizations actually said, oh, wow, alerts are going off. Like, I actually have this Log4j vulnerability, being executed at runtime. And so when we think about some of those different zero-day vulnerabilities that have attacked organizations over the last couple of years here, Log4j is probably the best example of what I give when it comes to something at runtime security, where organizations, again, didn't really know until things were running in production or things were running in real time. Something else we think about is insider threats. This is a big one. Insider threats, I feel like everybody wants to talk about, but nobody really puts security protections in place when it comes to insider threats. And that's because I think it's kind of the telltale sign where if it hasn't happened to me, then why do I need to protect it, right? And I think we need to change that mind shift, or change that mindset, and have a shift in understanding that insider threats are real. And when we think about insider threats, here's a great story where I knew an individual. Actually, this individual came up to me after a conference a couple months ago, and this individual ran the API and application security program and company. And he said that there was a disgruntled employee that was given a 2-week notice, or told that they were being laid off, and it was a developer. And the developer did not enjoy the way that this company said, you were not going to be working here anymore. And so this individual purposely downloaded from GitHub malicious code and installed it and applied it to their frameworks or their code. And so the employee left, right? They got laid off. That employee left. And weeks later, that team was ready to push this new product or this new application to production. And it was sparked with malicious software and malicious malware everywhere. And it was because of a disgruntled employee. And so when we think about insider threats, we also need to make sure that we're having visibility into our employees, what they have access to. Is it a developer? Should they have access to a certain system or a repo or library, whatever it might be? And same thing for security, right? Understanding that if something is malicious or seems abnormal, do I have security alerting in place that could potentially alert me to go and investigate that? And the last thing we talk about is east-west traffic. Think about that as from, sometimes malicious code or the attacker is already inside your organization and they're moving laterally, right? Or even if, again, I give an example from one developer to the next developer, they're pushing code, but they didn't do a code check for security. And they don't know if actually my code that I got open source is malicious. And so as you're pushing that code from developer to developer, there may be malicious content or malicious aspects of that or characteristics of that already sitting inside of your organization that you don't know about. And so making sure you're actually protecting your applications from the inside and at the edge is super, super, super important. And so that's where ThreatX as a company, as we have seen this going. And I talked a little bit about Log4j in general, again, but I just want to kind of highlight the point here that, we talked about runtime impact, that malicious code is executed at the context of that Java application. We talked about the real-time exploitation that, unlike some other vulnerabilities that require an attacker to gain access, this was actually just sending malicious log messages to exploit the vulnerability. And last but not least, the risk, right? We have to get away, not 100%, but from everything that's coming inside our network. And we need to start to have visibility and have the glasses on about what's actually transversing inside of my network as well. So let's get into a little bit about ThreatX. Obviously, this was kind of teeing up about how we look at the world, how we're able to help our prospects and customers alike. And I think the first thing, like most things in cybersecurity, really starts with discovery, right? The visibility. So understanding what type of APIs do I have? Do I have external APIs that are external facing? Do I have internal APIs that are connecting, application to application? Maybe it's a time off or a PTO system that connects with payroll, right? Those could be internal APIs potentially, or something that was custom developed within your organization. And so it always starts pretty much, in my opinion, with discovery. Understanding what's on my network, what's off my network, who has access to that, how was it documented, and what is the intended function of those APIs. From there, we move into the detection. When we think about detection, this is really identifying behaviors that appear to be present or a risk to your APIs or applications. And I think, again, detection, every company does it a little differently, every vendor out there, right? But I think really it's taking a holistic approach of not just looking at, for example, just IPs, right? It's one thing to just have a system that says, okay, I understand this IP address comes from maybe a location that we don't do business with, or that may be risky to our corporation, so we want to block it. While that's fine, there's also missing context. Where is that API or where is that IP? Who had access to it? How are they actually trying to hit your organization, your API, your application? And are you doing things like IP interrogation? Or are you doing things like, I want to fingerprint that IP? So it goes beyond just looking at IPs and does more things like, for example, having a context engine. So understanding the context, understanding your business and your risk behind that. Is this application connecting to my main third-party supply chain vendor? And if for some reason we had an incident breach, we would have a loss of revenue. Maybe that has a higher threshold of risk to it, right? Or those APIs do. So understanding the context of your business, understanding the context of the attacker. From there, you move to different things like active deception. You can look at attacker and user behavior. In addition to that, you want to track these behaviors, which is the third pillar, over time. As I mentioned before, a lot of technologies are what we call signature-based. They say, if this plus this is true, then give me this outcome. But that's really kind of, black or white in the sense of like, we're just basing it off static signatures. And where the market's going, where ThreatX is going, is we need to have more of a behavioral contextual engine behind that, understanding the behavior over time. Because somebody might come into your organization, might be probing, doing some reconnaissance today, and there may be nothing malicious about it. They flew under the radar. But maybe 6 months from now, they come back maybe it is the same IP address, or it's sometime, maybe the signatures are the same, or maybe the way they did the data flow exfiltration is the same. And we need to take a look at the entire overall encompassing picture from a behavioral standpoint and understand what's actually happening to these threats. The acronym I give is called BAD, BAD. B stands for behavior, understanding the behavior of your APIs, understanding what's normal look like. From there, the A, which is abnormal, have alert notifications or have different mechanisms in place that can say, this API is acting or this application is acting abnormal. It is outside the range of what normal is for your business. D is your decision or your detection, right? And that is making sure, okay, we understand it is abnormal now. We've baselined it. It's abnormal. We need to put rules in place, for example, that say, or a threshold that says, okay, maybe this is over 80 and out of 100, and 80 for us for this application is really bad. So we need to go do something like block list or allow list an IP address or some type of threat that might be happening with my organization. So when we think about that BAD acronym, that can apply to a lot of things in cybersecurity, but specifically we take the acronym and that contextual concept and we apply it to our products and our platform as well. And so it really starts with these 4 pillars, right? Discovering APIs, detecting your threats, tracking that behavioral analytics over time, and then from there deciding, right? Do I want to alert something? Do I want to block something for this organization? So from there, a couple more slides left. The first thing I want to talk about here is, what does the platform actually look like? And from a standpoint of what is it actually doing? I mentioned before, we started 10 years ago looking at API and application protection from the edge. That is your layer 7. And so when you think about this is a fully SaaS solution. So it's fully hosted and managed by ThreatX. We do all the things I talk about, discovering your APIs, right? From an HTTP, HTTPS traffic, what's going on, detecting and tracking your threats, and then blocking. But this is your traditional, what you typically see in the market as far as an inline reverse proxy. So again, sitting at layer 7 reverse proxy, seeing that traffic, and then saying, is that traffic good or bad over time from a behavioral standpoint, and then doing some type of deciding or doing some type of action with that. From there, we can do the tracking, alerting, reporting, and making sure that we're blocking based upon in real time. So this has not gone away. This is still the core of what we do. However, as I mentioned before, kind of with that house analogy, we start to hear from more and more customers in the industry of kind of what's happening going on, that there was a need for something else. There was a need for an additional aspect of this. And this is what we have coined and called the ThreatX Runtime API and Application Protection product, which is for short, it's called RAAP, RAAP. But again, what it's doing here is it's discovering your APIs, especially your unknown APIs. A lot of times organizations say, we don't even know how many APIs we have until we get in there with either our edge protection and or our RAAP solution and can do some discovery or cataloging of what you actually have in there. And I will say, I use a statistic a couple times, but on average, when we go in and we say, how many APIs do you have? On average, it is usually anywhere between 8 and 10 times more APIs that we find than the organization thought they had. That's a huge statistic. And so when we think about that, right, because sometimes organizations forget about those internal APIs, or they forget about the applications that may not be running in production yet, or developers just creating, but maybe that API does have access to PII information or sensitive data. And so typically what we're doing, again, is we're doing assessments and scans pre-customer, and then we're saying, okay, you have now X amount of APIs, let's document them, let's catalog that. From the runtime protection, again, this is actually leveraging a technology called eBPF, Extended Berkeley Packet Filtering. And there's some vendors, some technology companies that use this. What it's doing is actually sitting at the kernel, the Linux kernel level. So this does have to be applied in a Kubernetes environment. And what it's doing is it's actually there as a sidecar container. Now, a lot of organizations will say, oh, it sounds like that category back in the day called RASP, which I think stands for Runtime Application Self-Protection. Similar in the sense of kind of what it's doing, different in the sense that RASP requires agents. They require a lot of memory, a lot of utilization, a lot of overhead for IT and security teams to maintain, because you got to deploy an agent at every single application at the kernel level. And this is lucky because we can sit at the node level of a sidecar container and still get that traffic and way more from network monitoring flows, malicious attempts, abnormalities, process calls, commands that are being executed or being run on that. And this really helps when you start to think about it, kind of comes full circle when we think about how an attacker moves pretty much low and slow nowadays, and they're going after your applications in a runtime like that 0-day log4j, right? Runtime would help with that because we can see the commands that are being executed. We can see if anyone's trying to do something malicious like monitoring network flow or something with that application is going array. And so this is really the difference of how we looked at this field and how we completely combined it with both of our protection. So just for clarification, this is one platform. So as of today, the ThreatX platform does combine the edge protection, which is our existing, layer 7 reverse proxy. In addition to that, we also now just released our runtime and API application protection. So now you have full coverage. So now you have that bodyguard that's sitting again, or the bouncer that's sitting outside the club, but now you also have the bouncer that's walking inside the actual venue, so you can see everything that's going on inside your application. Again, this will protect with things against like DDoS, so against things like 0 days east-west traffic, all combined into one solution, one platform. So with that being said, the one thing I will include is a lot of organizations come up to me and they say, Jeremy, the product and the solution sounds great, sounds right up our alley. We just don't have the staffing to handle this, right? We don't have the internal resources to manage another tool or to even look at alerts and notifications. The nice thing about ThreatX is we combine the platform with a managed security operations center. We call it protection as a service. Think of it as an extension to your security team. No extra charge. So this comes with the platform. This comes with the one contract that you get. So you get your edge protection, your runtime protection, but you can have this all fully managed as much as you want by the ThreatX team. And this is a team that works 24/7, 365 days, and they can do anything. Every customer is different. Every prospect is different. Some say, we really want you guys to do tier 1 and tier 2. We'll handle tier 3. Send us alert notifications. Let's work inside of a tool. We can do that as well. Some organizations say, hey, we already have a 300-person security team. They're lucky. And they say, we don't need you guys until we actually start to do an investigation or we start to actually work with that customer. Then they say, you know what? We could use you guys for maybe rule tuning or creation, or we're thinking about doing something different. Can we use you as an advisor or consultant? So every organization can pick and choose how they leverage to use our protection as a service. And I think that's a really unique benefit differentiator because one, we're not charging you actually for it. And then number two, you can use this any single way you want, whether it's completely managing and you get your marketing here, get your nights and weekends back, but really you can get your nights and weekends back. And that's actually a quote that comes from one of our customers that said, we got our nights and weekends back because we leveraged the ThreatX managed SOC. So that's a really nice addition to the entire solution suite, as I mentioned, from a technology standpoint, but also the human aspect of that as well. Now, again, I'll kind of leave you in the last slide of why ThreatX, and we're going to get into something just a little bit different here for the remaining time. But why ThreatX? Again, protecting all your APIs and applications from external, internal, public-facing, third-party supply, rogue APIs, zombie APIs as well. That risk-based blocking, so that behavioral detection, as I mentioned, over time, to understand what is the context of your business, what is the context of your applications. Now let's go into side versus just being static and signature-based. From there, we have the edge protection and the runtime protections to get that all on one platform. It's agentless. Again, it's sidecar containers or sensors sitting up at the reverse proxy and encompassing all of that with a protection as a service. So ultimately, we are protecting your APIs and applications with confidence, not complexity, and you get the full protection, the full suite, all encompassing in one. So with that being said, I'm going to go to the final kind of part of my presentation. And I love this one because this one is a little vendor agnostic. And usually when I get up to speak, sometimes it's either ThreatX focus or sometimes it's let's just talk about API security. So this portion right here is going to be just partially API security. A lot of individuals, a lot of teams come up to me and say, Jeremy, this is great. I don't even know where to start. We know APIs are important, but I don't really know how to build a team. I don't really know where to start. Yes, you can Google it. Yes, you can go to NIST, there's SANS, and they have great resources on, what are the fundamental things you need to do with API application security. But what I did is put together a couple different slides and programs here of how anyone could start and or mature your API security program. So even if you already have a program, this also gives you some more insight into how to evolve that program and mature it over time. So as mentioned before, I mentioned that majority of cybersecurity, but especially with APIs and applications, is visibility, right? Understanding, again, where are my APIs? What are they doing? What calls are they making? How are they documented? Is this API written in, JSON or XML? Or is it a REST API? Is it a GraphQL API, which is an up and coming newer type of API versioning? And so when we think about this stuff, it's really important to understand first visibility, the documentation. That's fundamental to how you build this program. From there, you can go and document it as again. So is the API actually coded the way being used. And that can cause a lot of different headaches sometimes for security and engineering teams when sometimes you developed it a certain way, but it's being used a complete opposite way, for better or worse. From there, this also goes into ownership. Again, I mentioned that Spider-Man meme where they all look at each other, but understanding if something goes on, who owns that application? Who owns that API? Is it security? Is it our outsourced team overseas? Is it this team right here? Is it marketing? Is it engineering? Is it development? Whatever it might be, right? Understanding once you've understood your APIs and you understand where they sit in your environment, understanding what is the usage of them, who owns them. And this really helps with these two concepts. I briefly mentioned it in the last slide, but I'll kind of dig into it a little bit more. First is rogue APIs. And these are sometimes used interchangeably with the word shadow. So shadow APIs. But these are typically APIs that were created without the proper governance and control. So a lot of times what I've seen is developers and engineering will create these APIs because they were asked to from management, or there was a specific need right at that time, and they didn't really think about documenting how they created it or what it's doing. There's pretty much no access or authentication to it. Anyone could pretty much use it. These are scary because these were typically created for some purpose, but there was no control about security or what the functioning intention was and how it was supposed to be used. From there, we also go to zombie APIs. And the reason I put this bullet point is because a lot of times when you look at some of the incidents and breaches that have happened, it's typically through rogue and zombie APIs, the things that the security engineering team didn't even know about. Zombie APIs are also scary because these are typically the APIs that are outdated. They don't have the right versioning control. They were forgotten, or they had a specific use and they were never decommissioned. This happens a lot. And actually, one of those logos I showed you early in the presentation, one of those companies had a zombie API where the security team and engineering team said, nope, we know it's not in use anymore, it's decommissioned, until they got hacked. And then they found out, oh, wait a second, we never went through the proper process to actually fully decommission it. And it was still accessible via the public or via the public internet. And that is how they got popped. And so making sure you have proper visibility, your versioning, you have built-in control and processes can really help with these two headaches that cause everybody when it comes to rogue and zombie APIs. But this is where you start. So documenting the ownership clarification. From there, this goes into a little bit about the red and blue teaming. I'm not going to read specifically through every single one, but you'll have the context later. But red teaming, I feel like, a lot of times in security, when you're actually working in like a security operations center, you pretty much sit on one of these sides or both, where it's a red teaming, which is typically your offensive security, your pen testers, your threat hunters, potentially, right? These are the individuals that are looking to find the gaps, the security gaps within your organization, and then hopefully make them better. And I could have put 100 different things on both sides, but here are just 5 recommendations on how to get started on both sides. So from a red teaming, it's really understanding the number one, I think, one of the number one things is authentication and authorization. So this really means like ensuring that you're testing for weak passwords, you're testing for insufficient validation of access tokens, making sure that the mechanisms are working. So authentication, right? How I'm authenticating to this application or this API? Who has access to it? From an authorization standpoint, are you doing and testing for verification and validate? Right. So even think about that concept of zero trust when it comes into APIs and applications, right? Don't trust anything until you've authenticated and you authorize properly to your apps and APIs. From there, we go into other things like input validation. So looking at common different types of web application attacks. So making you can block malicious input. Same thing with encryption. Encryption is really, really important, especially if you have APIs that are sending business logic or business data or sensitive data, PII data, financial information, PHI data across the wire. So making sure you're testing for the right types of encryption key strength. Make sure you're testing for things like SSL and TLS, which you'll see on the blue team side as well. And then making sure you're actually putting the proper encryption mechanisms in place. A couple other things right in the red team side, we have rate limiting and throttling. So making sure that your APIs can handle different types of potential abuse, right? So can your API handle, your application handle a big overload of traffic? Typically call that DDoS or denial of service attacks, right? Where we see that a lot, where attackers will go after organizations and take a website down for X amount of time, right? Can your application withstand a DDoS attack, right? Can it throttle and degrade itself if, for example, there was a major attack going on against your application or API? And last but not least, business logic tests. This is definitely one of the OWASP top 10s, kind of mixed around in a couple different spots, but understanding again, is the API functioning in the intended way it was supposed to be? So looking at different access controls, looking at different aspects of API functionality, looking at potentially were there any vulnerabilities in there as well. Then we move to the blue teaming side. These are typically your SOC analysts, your incident response team. These are the individuals that are protecting, typically staying up all night, hopefully not, but, protecting your organization and making sure that you're secure. Again, I work for ThreatX, which is a, API and application security. So traditionally played on the WAP side, we do runtime. But again, if I'm building a program and I've given a big budget and team, I would actually put an API gateway in there as well. And we'll talk about defense in depth and why it's so important. But a gateway really does handle good aspects when it becomes between the mediator of your API and your external client. So when we think about authentication and authorization, right, API gateways can really provide good protection as that's what they were built to do, right? To understand your APIs, who's authenticating, who's authorizing it. They can even do some things that I mentioned before around rate limiting and throttling as well. Making sure you're using things around OAuth and, for example, JWT tokens to actually validate and verify who can access these APIs or how the encryption standard's going. Same thing with making sure we're using the highest encryption standards, TLS 1.3, 1.2, SSL. Same thing the last couple ones for blue teaming. Typically, when we think about SOC analysts, right, it's typically sitting behind big SIM technologies or data lakes or some type of event management system, making sure you're logging the API incidents and alerts that you have, but more than logging, making sure that you're actually monitoring. Again, I go back to that acronym of BAD, making sure you're actually picking out abnormalities that are in there, understanding that this potentially is a threat, or how does this data correlate to other technologies with my security entire ecosystem as well. And last but not least, investing in an API security tool like ThreatX that can do different things like protection as a service or managed SOC that can do real-time blocking and protection, can do all the discoverability things that we talked about, but also looking at runtime as well. So I always like to leave this slide with, it's not just shift left and it's not just shift right. It's really, given the aspects and the circumstances, it's really shifting everywhere in your system. And we finally take it to the last couple of things here. So when we put this all together, it's really about what we call purple teaming. And typically purple teaming isn't really a specific title that is given to an individual, at least not yet. Purple teaming is really more the collaboration and the concept of how do you get the red team and the blue team together. Red plus blue equals purple. And so when we think about that, it's really about understanding what's going on in the real world. So making sure we are testing your APIs and applications using threat modeling and emulation. So actually looking at the collaboration aspect of, okay, here's what the red team found. Here's what the blue team is protecting against. Can we test our APIs using real world scenarios, real world exercises that can actually help? Making sure you have different attack simulations, as we mentioned before, doing continuous security modeling, effectively making sure you have incident response playbooks, because as we all know, it's not if, it's when. So understanding that, do I have flexible policies, procedures in place that are followed, right? Are you actually doing tabletop exercises when it comes to your incident response teams and updating them as new threats evolve, as new threats emerge, or as you build a new application that may have a lot of, the crown jewels to your organization. So making sure you're partnering with your different stakeholders across departments and putting together an incident response playbook. And last but not least, the last slide is, what does this all come down to at the end of the day? It's really three things, right? And we've all seen these in our time in our fields, but it's really people, process, technology. And I think you can really use this concept in a lot of different areas, but I like to say people being number one, because at the end of the day, no matter what technology you have in place, we've all been there. It comes down to people, right? It really does. And so making sure you're doing again, red team to blue teaming, it's almost like getting them to work and collaborate together, right? That's the whole concept of purple teaming, but making sure we're including security awareness training, making sure security is not viewed as the stopgate. It's security, again, bothering the engineers and, they're slowing us down in our process, right? Finding the right process that works for your teams, including engineering, development, and security. From there, again, we talked a lot about process and the threat modulating, the threat emulation. But lastly, it's technology. I mentioned this before, defense in depth, making sure as much as possible you're mitigating and you're responding to your threats in different layers, right? Putting multiple security guards, again, in different layers of your aspect, because we know, again, from the earlier slides, attackers are getting more sophisticated. They're using more automation, how to get into your organization. So with that being said, looking at everything you do when you build this team from a people, process, technology standpoint can really start to give you the fundamental building blocks of how to be actually successful within your organization. So with that being said, I want to thank everybody. I think we've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to check the Q&A in just a second. I know Jared's going to come back on right now too, but I want to thank everybody again for joining this presentation. If you would like to connect to LinkedIn and learn more about kind of what I do and what ThreadX does, feel free to scan the QR code as well. Go to threadx.com to learn more about API and application security production. But with that being said, I will look at some of the Q&A right now and see how many we can get to. But are there specific compliance standards or regulations that organizations should be aware of when securing their APIs? And there definitely is. And Lynn, thank you for the question. So especially depending on the industry you're in, I know for a lot of organizations that are in financial, they have to abide by PCI, right? Especially if you're accepting, transmitting, storing credit card data. And so I know there's a lot of, I don't know the specific regulation or the specific PCI requirement anymore, but I think it's like 6.1.2, if I remember. We need to have effective applications, right? You need to have inventory control, especially when we think about things like nowadays, like GDPR from a compliance standpoint. While GDPR is still kind of vague, even though the fines are pack a punch for an organization, understanding, again, what your industry, your organization's in, how do I comply to that from a compliance standpoint? And then doing things like the basics, again, inventory, documentation. We talk a lot about, software bill of materials. Do I understand what the packages and libraries are and applications are and how they're built? That should give you a pretty good kind of example of how to go. So that one was just published. Let's see. Let's see, go in there. Next question was, is your protection as a service staff 24/7? It is 24/7, 365 days. That team is mostly based in the United States, but we do have individuals across the pond to help, especially with that 24/7. So let's see. Will the slides be posted? I know, Jared, you can handle that. Slides will be posted, and this all recording, as Jared mentioned earlier, later. And a couple more. Is it a URL actually an API from the browser to the web app? Yeah, you could absolutely make this sense, especially if they're sending data, right? Or there is data stored or transmitted in that as well. And then last but not least, was the amount of internet traffic, I think that's related to the 80%, of bytes, packets, or number of sessions open, since APIs are often one session per interaction. So I actually believe it's the latter. So to your point, bytes and packets of sessions open. And we can actually, Postman actually has that report where you can actually go and actually specifically see. So I won't specifically think specifically talk for Postman, but we'll go from there. With that being said, I believe that is all the questions we have for now. So again, I want to thank everybody again. You can reach out to me. Please go to threadx.com as well if you'd like to learn more information. TechStrong, thank you very much for having us. And as usual, and Jared, thank you. And I know you have some closing remarks as well.
Yep. All right. That was outstanding. One quick thing, just to let everybody know, there are other people who are still experiencing issues with Log4j. So it's actually great to hear ThreadX helps you throughout your whole path. I was on a webinar not too long ago. They mentioned Log4j is still beating them up. So I'm not with ThreadX, I'm with TechStrong. So just letting you know that that's awesome that Jeremy is bringing that up to everybody's attention. So on that note, thank you, Jeremy, for taking your time, sharing your expertise with us. A quick reminder that today's session was being recorded. I can reach out to everyone and get you the handouts following with the panel, and a link to access the on-demand recording as well. You can also go to Security Boulevard website, securityboulevard.com/webinars to get the on-demand if the link doesn't come to you through email. And a quick reminder, I did mention that I'll be giving out 2 $50 Amazon gift cards. Keep an eye out on your email. And I'd like to thank ThreadX for sponsoring today's program. Also want to, again, thank each of you for joining the entirety of the presentation. If you do have another moment, once this session ends, you will have a survey that pops up. Just tell us how we did, what we can do to improve, any information that you can give us to help us improve. That would be very helpful, and we appreciate it. So my name is Jared Harris. Again, thank you for attending the program, and I will be signing out.